Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Lounge with 2MK team. Today we are, as always, playing Street Fighter V. You are, of course, free to join us. This is one of our Winner's Days on lobbies, mainly because it doesn't give you the other option. And today we will be talking about a method of play that you can use for multiple purposes. One, to teach yourself patience and pacing, to give yourself a quote-unquote handicap against a less experienced player without necessarily going easy on them in the strictest sense, and to help yourself learn particular things in terms of flow and meter watching even. So we'll call this holding the line, in that your main goal is to pick a spot on the stage, probably just behind you from wherever your character starts. Trying to get forward is generally stressful. But some spot behind you.
Round one. Fight.
Or maybe even the spot you're standing on, depending. And defend that spot. Stand on it, make sure your opponent does not push you off it too much. You can still finish your combos, but for the most part, once your opponent has been knocked away by anything, you generally don't want to go after them too much. This helps you pace yourself a lot better, even though it is not pure advantage. And against players who are less experienced than you, it gives them a metric, especially if you tell them you're doing it, for when they have to worry about pressure or not. Meaning that basically, if you are on the spot and they are not on the spot, it is their turn to attack. And they have to come up with a way to do this. However, if they occupy your spot, they know that you are probably going to try to counterattack them. Now generally this doesn't work as well if both players pick the same option, unless they also pick the same spot. But you can still use it a lot of ways, and generally if you're fighting against an opponent who is either very aggressive or you can't tell what their game plan is, this can be a decent way to force them to show you what their game plan is. Another interesting thing we found is that while the game does not necessarily give those ratings at the end of matches like attack and defense all that well by most standards, interestingly, the better you can do this, the higher they will rate you defense-wise. Not necessarily in the you are defensive versus offensive, but rather that little thing at the end that tells you attack, technique, defense, the little circle chart graph thing. You can raise your defense rating on that chart by being able to do this. And when you fail to defend yourself on the spot, it seems to result in a lower score, but you can check this yourself. Overall though, if you can't really tell, if you're focused on the match and trying to decide did I do well or not, you can at least give it a look at the end and decide whether or not it was accurate enough to how you felt about it. Another thing that this does is give you a very clear idea of where your opponent's ranges are, since they're always relative to the same spot. You can tell how far away they're jumping from, what their plans are, and so on, based on this. It's also obviously a good way to tell how good your offense is. Because once your opponent is on said spot, you have to push them off. It's not just a matter of doing random things to do damage or whatever else. But it's also that you don't have the option of waiting for them to make a mistake.
Round one.
The freedom to then decide, okay, well, they're not going to play offense right now. They have the spot. I have to defeat them. Can get you to at least start to think of the offense mindsets required to take those sort of positions. And to recognize your opponent's options in those spaces. You may end up noticing over time that you're more likely to telegraph your intentions than you thought you were. Once you've taken away the mind game of your opponent having to worry about whether or not you're going to play offense, defense, or certain types of footsies, you get to learn a lot more about what your offensive flow is like, simply because it's the only thing you have left to use. This is quite the opposite of our previous, let's call it, series on corner guard, which was essentially about getting your opponent to the corner as quickly as possible and figuring out how to make sure you beat them up once they try to get out of it. However, you can also consider this to be a form of that, in that an opponent who is on their chosen spot should have at least one or two ideas about how to keep that position without having to give up too much ground.
You win.
This isn't to say that you can't backdash out of certain things and then counterattack, but if your play was to basically just backdash and keep running away or outranging your opponent, that's a different style of training. That has to do with life leads.
That makes the match completely different. I picked, so you may have noticed, I picked the lamp on the back wall right at the corner there. And I did a pretty good job of staying on it, but it really completely changes the sort of experience of the match in a way, I guess. Oh god, this is going to be terrifying to do against Zangief. Oh man.
It's actually easier than you think, because you
Alright.
can avoid Zangief in particular ways, but I'm more
Alright.
concerned about whether or not it's going to be laggy.
Well, we'll find
They
out.
appear to be 3 bars to us, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could be good anyway.
I wasn't paying
It's going to be
attention.
hard against this particular one because this Mart has balanced, so yeah.
Oh. Alright then.
Round one. Fight.
This is rather laggy.
I see. We can't see it from here. For us, it appears to be running smooth as ever.
Yeah, it's not the super extreme type, but it's the type where it's lots of little. Rather than any big stuff. So it's quite choppy on my end.
I see.
Round two. Fight.
Actually, I have no idea how well I did that round, because he managed to keep me quite entirely occupied. Unlike fighting Amara, who is quiet and often defensive, this one will certainly put the pressure on. Ah, crap. What? Alright then. It seems to have cleared up at least a little bit, so hopefully it'll stay that way.
Well, do remember that you can punish his charged heavy punch with Light Mujin, which is kind of the point of that whole thing that we were doing back then.
Fight!
I just have to manage to not be hit by it.
Well, I mean, you can always just crush counter sweep it too, which is the other part of how that works.
Indeed. Nope. Alright then.
Round 2. Fight!
But yet again, it's basically a way of showing you how legit your own offense is when you don't have pressure, for example.
Indeed. Alright then. Well, let's see how many bars he shows up as to me. If he's 3 to you, we did decide we were being slightly stricter about lag today. Three bars here, so we'll probably see more of the same. Yep.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Alright.
Their style is not really one where you can generally say, oh, I'm dying because of the lag. Though I believe it would lead to some frustrations. For the most part, I guess, it'll mostly come down to, will you be able to whiff punish the heavy punch every time, and can you jump out of every running bear grab?
Yes, more or less. And I don't think the lag should be severe enough to interfere with that too heavily.
At that point, it becomes up to them whether or not they want to deal with it that way.
Either way, it was an interesting experience. I definitely noted something about my offense being weak in some way or another, and I don't seem to remember what the specifics of it was. But regardless of that, it's definitely, as I noted, it's somewhat more difficult to do this against an opponent that's going to try and come in and take up your space a bit more aggressively than Amara would. Especially since he could knock me back with his heavy punch and such. Especially if he manages to land it. I can imagine this being somewhat harder for Cosmic Wolf, as he is charge based, and therefore
That
drops
doesn't really
his...
tend to matter too much, though. In fact, actually, it makes it easier.
Ah,
Once you're on the spot, it's easier, and once you're off it, it's harder.
right. Okay.
Round 2. Fight.
So let's see. Does he have a spot?
Final round. Fight.
But once you're trained in this enough, it gives you the sort of confidence required to do things like know your opponent's attack won't hit you from the range they're launching it, and proceed with whatever else you wanted to do. So, for charge characters, it becomes easier in that regard. You know, I don't have to try to react to this. I've seen this situation enough times to know this is not going to hit me. So I can just armor up or whatever else.
Yes, that seems like an extremely useful thing for someone who isn't able to just take a step back at will. It'll be extremely useful for me because it will strengthen my whiff punishing ability and, well, a great many other things, to be quite honest. But I'll at least have the option to just, like, step back. So I can sort of cheat a little bit.
The other reason is that most down charge moves are not moves you use to defend your spot.
Round 1. Fight.
You use them to get out of things or for offense in a lot of cases.
What about headbutt and flash kick
in-
sword?
Even then, flash kick, I would guess you would give that to, but Guile could defend his spot without having to ever actually get up.
Okay, that's fair. Guile is kind of a master at that.
Fight.
But for example, Urian's headbutt is not really for guarding his spot. He has lots of other options, long normals, the metallic spheres you're now seeing, and so on, that functionally do a better job of this in a lot of situations. And once you've decided, I don't really need to hold down back that much, a lot of Urian's longer normals become easier to use, since you never technically have to give up the back charge just to do this. Unless you were worried about the opponent doing something in a way that would cause you to lose the down back charge, then you probably are fine.
Final round. Fight.
You know, one thing I did note is that I feel like it might make your reactions more difficult against things like running bear grab or such things where you're... If you stay in one spot for too long, it's also, I suppose, part of the training in the end to manage to maintain your awareness and flexibility while you're there, and keep a good track of your opponent. Come to think of it, even though I...
don't know, because it has the exact opposite effect on me.
Right, I was actually about
Because
to say...
I have to be so unafraid of everything when you're doing it, yeah, you end up doing a lot of that.
I was actually just realizing as I listened to myself talk, that, come to think of it, although I would expect that effect because it's something I experience normally when I'm doing that that sort of position, I don't think I had that problem in my prior matches just now, which is interesting. Because obviously it requires a great deal of awareness, but I guess it's a way through that bit of problem that I seem to sometimes have. I'm not entirely sure why.
A lot of it comes from the fact that most of us play fighting games from a position of feeling downtrodden and feeling afraid. And unfortunately, a lot of other people play it from the perspective of feeling like they can do whatever they want. Both of these mindsets are bad, and this is the way to technically fix both of them, or at least somewhat fix them.
Indeed. Yes, I suppose it would be, because I can just feel, once I'm on my point, I can just be like, okay, I'm doing fine, good luck, try and push me off. And then it just makes it very clear so that we can't end up in the sort of emotional pressure outside of a very well-defined factual situation. Very
This
useful.
is one of the most important things to learn emotionally in these games. That sometimes you think you have problems, but you don't actually have problems.
The whole problem is
And if you just changed your goal, you would realize you don't actually have problems. Because often what we feel is we must do these things before our opponent can do something we can't handle. And this makes us lose track of our options, lose track of our meter, and forget that we have options for specific situations. And sure, you can go, well, what if I need those options later? But if your mindset and plan is, I'm trying to hold this spot, there is no later. You're either holding the spot or you aren't.
So now I forgot to watch and try and figure out where Amara's spot would be. Oh. I suppose it also ends up effectively forcing you to take mini breaks whenever your opponent is like out of range or you have your spot and you're good to go for a moment. It forces you to sort of reset yourself and think about the options and situations and such, so you never end up in a position where you're effectively stuck, like trying to do things and not necessarily... If you forget an option, you have time to remember it, basically. Or to think about however you got on tilt the last interaction set. So I figure Amara's spot is basically where she's standing right now, that little point in the floor.
The other thing you can use it for is to figure out just how intimidating you find any given character. If you can get to your spot and think, okay, I'm good now, it means you probably don't find the character you're facing all that scary. If you find yourself getting super twitchy and afraid, it generally means that you feel as if that opponent can do something. But forcing yourself to stay on the spot will often show you whether or not that is true, at least against the given opponent. It can also help you understand which of your tools you use because you have that feeling, which your opponent might be able to tell. Like, if you do this certain amount of times, then you've probably telegraphed it. So there's a lot of little nuances you can pick up a bit relative to this, autopilot, reactions, and so on.
It's go time.
Yes, it seems like it pulls a lot of pieces together in, honestly, a very sort of easy way.
Let's do this.
But I'll let you focus on your own match for now.
Alright. I need to choose my own spot in this shadowy base floor. Well, I suppose it's not technically called shadowy base, but it is the shadowy base. So let's go.
My iron body is invincible. Round one. Fight.
I'll start with here.
But yes, the other main thing this gives you is forces you to have an understanding of how to react to an opponent who can outspace you or who constantly seems to have better spacing. If they can make you go to a particular distance from them, then obviously you have to figure out what they want to do from there and what you could do without moving or launching an attack of your own. This is particularly useful for aggressive players like you and I because sometimes the opponent is really just waiting for us to move because we're at that distance. And we can be baited into a lot of things if we get scared of them in some way and have this problem.
Okay. I am, not doing so well right now. But part of that is actually because I'm refusing to retreat and come back in, more or less. I'm trying a little too hard to hold my point, rather than to take the approach to it as a sort of broader thing, which is causing me some level of troubles. So let's see if I can change that around this time.
Round one. Fight.
Well, I mean, I technically I have the life lead. Aw man, the lag hid the whole dash.
Still mostly got it. This is the other reason it's useful, because it forces you to take stock of when you are technically winning. Yeah, your opponent can go, I'm over here, but you could also always go, I have the life lead, what are you doing? You can literally think of it as racking up points for standing on the spot. They don't get to beat you that way.
Oh dear. Alright then. Well, I certainly did better this time around. Simply by awareness of that particular factor.
Round two. Fight.
Now, of course, this isn't to say that you shouldn't generally go in when you know you can get in, but sometimes, just sometimes, you're really just better off leaving your opponent completely alone. Because if you have the life lead in certain situations against certain characters, going in is literally just taking a relatively large risk, even if it's just like 40%. Whereas sometimes standing there and defending is nearly no risk.
Oh dear. Alright then.
You lose.
That was honestly in part disastrous because he realized that because I would just stand there, I would always lose the opening gambit dash up SPD. And I only realized that basically the last time around. So really I need a neutral jump. Because I mean, it's still technically on my spot. But also because it beats the opening that he provided. Backdash and twirl or various things would presumably also work. So it's sort of a matter of staying at my spot to a higher strategy level like I just mentioned. Which, honestly, is probably pretty useful because it's not something that I bring to the game as much as I certainly know that I should, and somewhat as much as I would like to.
If nothing else, it forces one to explore more options than you're used to using because the problem space has changed. Or the problem space has disappeared.
Indeed. And as you mentioned, I should just do opening gambit Light Mage and Kaku. It would check his dash, solve that whole problem set, and move me forward maybe a quarter of a step. I suppose it must be, like, a matter of building the habit, but how does one think of those things? I guess I'm just so stuck up in how I normally play the match and how I normally approach things that I just don't think of all of my options in all of my situations, more or less, which is, I suppose, probably also limiting in terms of general gameplay and trying to build or even apply a style, simply because you would need to, well, think of things to do in various situations as you're building up your skills or, well, matchups.
Generally, you can honestly start to think of it this way. When you reach this point in Street Fighter around Silver, sometimes in lower if you have good execution but are having trouble like holding yourself back from hanging yourself. In fact, I'd say at nearly any level, if you find that you tend to choke in matches and die because your opponent adapted around you, this is a good way to train because the times you win in matches is usually because you went for pressure. And the pressure worked. And the better your opponent is at resisting pressure, the less likely you are to win. So you could have a good 50% win rate without necessarily having a lot of the skills and options required to say that you're good. If only because you don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. You streamline your game down to not necessarily a flowchart, but to a spacing and interaction that stresses the opponent out and lets you put as much push on them as possible. This is good. You should definitely learn to do this in nearly every fighting game. But you will eventually meet someone who just isn't fazed by that. And unless your character has effectively no holes in their offense, which is at the moment in this game exactly 3 characters, and getting started for them is hard. There are 2 that have, as we all love to hear about, nearly no holes in their offense, but on the other hand, they also don't have a good way to open you up because they don't have overheads. So they have to throw you, and then the offense goes away. They get damage, but this is still not really the same thing. Once you've learned to yourself, oh wait, I actually don't know how to do this without that, It will show you why you're losing to all those people who are just not afraid of you, or happen to guess out of your pressure, or actually understand your pressure, or something about it that deconstructs it. Or those rare people who just never get knocked down to get pressured in the first place. After all, there are still a few like that.
Yes, I've been becoming more and more aware, very aware, really, lately of the fact that I really don't have very much offense beyond pressure and such, or my opponent making mistakes. Because of another type of training I was doing that honestly is somewhat similar to this in terms of how one goes about it. I was working on maintaining particular spacing for my opponent rather than a particular space on the ground. But it reveals some of the same issues. So I think this will honestly help quite a bit as an alternative way to work on, well, thinking about that. In part because, obviously, with the other method I just mentioned, if my range is not varying, or I'm trying to hold an exact one, I'm going to encounter less option spaces, more or less, and less different situations that I have to find options for.
This is also a quicker way to learn certain things in matchups if you're not too dedicated to not losing. If you become mentally dedicated to holding your spot rather than winning the match, it may be possible to ignore your life bars long enough to change the way you think about a particular situation. Let's take into account, for example, Zangief's lariat, his actual lariat, not his feat trigger. Lariat is an easy way for Zangief to slide forward without putting himself in too much danger if the opponent doesn't have long crouching normals, for example.
Round one. Fight.
The move is also relatively hard to avoid if the Zangief player managed to walk and get close enough. But most of us have some way to deal with Zangief using this move, or trying to get into position to use this move, that we nearly never use. As a generality, the move that most characters use to deal with Lariat is not a move they're used to using in any other situation. But once you have learned it, most of the time it also becomes clear that the matchup itself is much easier for having that move, because it's not necessarily something that only works when Zangief does Lariat. He's not a character who's built to get in, at least not quickly, or with mix-ups. Meaning that if you can do this and swing that in front of him, he might clip you with a short whiff punish, but you're not usually going to get all that hurt by it. Most of the time, there's not a move that extends a particularly long hurt box, and generally, therefore, you're just safe to stick it out, even when he's not doing anything in particular. Okay, now I can see the lag here, but on the other hand, I mean, because most stuff lags out sometimes regardless of who's fighting, so we can't really say.
Zangief wins. Round one. Fight!
For example, right there was probably the exact illustration of this sort of problem. Cosmo technically could have held his spot without throwing fireballs and would have actually been more dangerous to the Zangief had he not thrown any, presumably because he would just be able to immediately do so. Once the metallic sphere was thrown and the Zangief player was able to jump and therefore get closer, things went downhill really fast. But technically, the situation that occurred to bring this up happened because of trying to zone in a scenario where zoning probably wasn't necessary just yet. Obviously the lag is affecting this quite heavily, but as an overall thing, you should generally think about this from the zoner side. We don't usually throw fireballs for the sake of throwing fireballs. In fact, if you try this without... This is why a lot of people were bad at Dowsing, especially when he first came out in this game. Because the obvious answer was, oh, arcane fireball that people can't jump in on, let's use that as much as possible. But so many characters had so many ways past that, and a lot of ways that they had past that were really, really dangerous to Dowsing. It went relatively poorly.
Zangief wins.
I'm probably gonna have to spend a while doing this sort of training. It seems like the answer to a lot of my, like, weird little hang-ups and things.
The weird thing is that this works in all games, even Dragon Ball FighterZ, where it would seem as if this is totally not how you should play Dragon Ball FighterZ, but it does work there too.
Huh. I'm gonna have to try that.
The main thing in that game is that you have to be cognizant of when you get deflected off your spot while trying to defend it. And not try to get back onto it immediately.
Round one.
Okay.
Fight!
Why that specifically? Just because you're too likely to get counterattacked?
Yeah, you're too likely to get counterattacked after that. They made sure that the spacing, we checked it multiple times, the spacing you end up at after being deflected off someone is actually fairly dangerous if you try to attack again immediately. Not because, like, there's specific things you can do or can't do, and obviously there's certain characters who have options there, but because your opponent is likely to be blocking, and you're the one who has lost some spacing, then you don't really know what to do, but they have a decent idea of what caused you to get deflected in the first place, right? So your situation is not positive for you.
Sure, I suppose they're ready for whatever offensive tactic you were using before. So you can't just repeat it, or anything really similar to it.
It's also because the range at which one gets deflected in Dragon Ball FighterZ is really difficult to hit most characters from. Most of the moves that hit people from there don't also go forward enough to be helpful. Like, they don't carry the player forward. They hit, but it's not as if they were pressure tools. That you keep the opponent quiet. But again, if you've changed the goal, and the goal is no longer, I'm not blocking you, I'm not letting you in, nothing. Your goal is, I am holding this position. No one cares about the fact that you hit them with that. Well, it's like lightening in the lag, relatively speaking, combined with the player's current choice of options. It has shifted this at least somewhat. Because as noted, eventually you can get to the feeling of realizing I don't actually have a problem. I expect to see them jumping with more heavy kick or doing more roundhouse or stuff in order to do things like that and bait uppercuts and have similar timings. But I'm not really sure this is going to work per se, because the other thing that one notices when this happens is that when players eventually decide I'm jumping in that way, it's not that Ryu can't uppercut, it's that a heavy uppercut is not the generally invincible one, so you tend to have the feeling you shouldn't use it for anti-airs. But it does reach further, and if your opponent is going to basically telegraph their movement from the other side of the screen, then it tends to work quite well. That said, it's not super easy to get yourself to do that when your responses were based on using the anti-air uppercut. I can imagine this even harder for Sagat players.
Why then?
Because Sagat's apparently Sagat's anti-air uppercut is his light one. Which I feel is just stressful because it means you've gone from, okay, I need to go to bigger range, but now I can't do it that way.
I see. I had assumed he got light and medium. Like, I think Cammy got modified too. In some recent season. Interesting. Alright then.
But yes, as expected, they were going to go for more ranged things that would be more likely to cause riffing. But once you've gotten used to that as their concept of how to play the fight, generally you can get more confidence in realizing you don't really have a problem. You can just not defend. Which gets really scary, but is required to play like certain forms of Chun-Li and certain forms of Urien. To just go, I don't have to respond to anything you're doing at all. You're just not dangerous. Because we have a tendency to assume that if our opponent is hitting buttons and we are blocking those buttons, that something bad is going to happen right after. This is actually a fairly bad assumption to have in this game. Because it makes us take actions that lead to us being caught up in their flow. Frustration players make a large amount of tricks and tactics around this concept that once you're being hit, you want to stop being hit. Once you're being approached, you want to make your opponent not approach you anymore. All of these things are psychological things that become fairly important after a while. Which is why you can sometimes hear about players who are scarier when they're near the corner because they're just so unafraid of you doing anything at all. Punk is actually one of these players. Punk is a player who is, against certain characters, known for just literally hanging out in the corner. He doesn't care.
Why exactly? I feel like that would probably make his, like, spacing trick with punish stuff a little more difficult. But I guess it doesn't need to be exactly in the corner.
The concept of Punk's spacing and with punish trick is for him to do, that's his form of offense. You don't
Ah,
necessarily care about this in terms of defensive mindset at all.
fair point. Indeed. Alright then.
Okay, now here's the acid test for lag, and I expect it to be bad, but again, the real flow of the Zangief player isn't so much so that it becomes a problem. It is actually that it illuminates the habits. So we'll see what Suntear manages to do. Because, again, mostly, especially with the spacings they're using, you don't have to do anything.
Yes, you basically just need to
Especially,
anti-air and maybe check dashes sometimes.
yeah, occasionally you have to check a dash. But the lag makes the jab string or the jab into heavy punch pretty stressful if you're trying to respond to them.
Round one.
This is also another good way to train, why I sometimes say to train in lag is because sometimes you know your opponent is going to do the same thing every time, yet you're still visually confirming that it's happened.
This then, of course, becoming problematic for reaction times. It can get really frustrating, depending.
You do have to learn to make a certain number of assumptions about your opponent's movement, or ideas of how the game plays, after a while anyway. For example, this Zangief has shown us that more or less their plan is to hit light, hit heavy, and then jump. So, the moment you've seen anything in that string, you've probably managed to do something.
Sure. Timing a perfect anti-air or air-to-air, no less.
Air-to-airs are probably the easiest method, because the Zangief doesn't specifically have a thing that follows the heavy punch that would beat most air-to-airs either. You'd be losing some damage in that you couldn't necessarily jump at him and expect to cross him up or do damage of your own in most situations, but you could still get something.
Round one. Fight.
But it's actually fairly hard to get ourselves to do this sort of thing.
I know that I would always have great trouble trusting an opponent to that degree. Unless they had managed to really well prove themselves.
Round two. Fight.
It kind of helps that uppercuts work so well at that.
Indeed.
The other thing you have to learn, and is super important, is that sometimes you have a problem, i.e. you're taking a lot of damage, but you didn't actually make a mistake. Sometimes these games just have things where your opponent gets to take a turn, have a chance, do something, and you have to take some damage. In fact, we've discussed this off stream before regarding the Wolf's flow, that sometimes you're just not actually able to do anything about it. Your mind is on enough other things that he just gets to do this. But if you don't take that much damage, or there's no big setup from it, then so be it.
You might as well pay a little HP every so often, just to not have to add a layer to your mental stack and drop something more damaging.
This is particularly important when the opponent needs to use meter to do this thing. Because if you have no other way in on X player, and you must use your EX move, your EX move that technically could be countered, but isn't usually. Okay, unless this move is going to lead into big pressure, most of the time, the winner is the one who will force you into that situation where the only option you have is using the move. Woe be unto you the moment they make the read that you're going to use the move and actually counter it, because then you just tend to die.
Just walking back a little bit solves a lot of problems.
Similarly, this also teaches you when the mistake you made is not based on the pressure or the opponent's specific flow. And it can be really frustrating to face that in yourself, of recognizing, for example, this opponent is jumping, as noted. Their range is such that Karin's air-to-air I don't think helps. Or maybe you'd have to like neutral jump heavy kick or something. I can't say for sure, but the point is that there's a lot of stuff they're doing. No, there you go. Just we're doing a little too early.
I hadn't done it at all yet, actually.
Oh, never mind.
I needed to get that into my game to begin with. But yes, once I have that, it will, it should work out fine. Well, I dodged the CA.
You should generally try not to feel bad in your mental inflexibility, let's say. It is a really difficult thing for us, for the most part, unless we've been playing these games for a long time, to recognize a situation that we've never seen before, or an option for a situation that we've never used before, and then just suddenly start using it.
But yes, that time I was just too slow. Plain and simple. Poor DP. Better! I didn't get, like, perfected 4 times in a row this time.
But at the same time, the problem that was created, the problem you were facing, was simply that you didn't wait until they jumped.
Mm-hmm.
Their understanding of how to play this matchup is hit crouch jab, hit stand heavy, jump. So that's it. That's the entire match. Until they do something else that actually hurts you. When you get to the point of thinking, but they could do something else. Yes, but how much does this something else hurt? How much of a problem is something else? As opposed to things you're potentially putting yourself into trouble doing by not being willing to wait. Like that. They're going to hit jab and then they're going to hit heavy. But every time you harm yourself by trying to respond to the jabs, or assume something else is coming, so I should do something about these jabs, you cause yourself stress. And the stress generally leads to you eventually losing.
Dang it.
There's another upper level to this that is even more difficult. When your opponent is going to wait and see whether or not you tried to respond before they jump or before they go for the next move. This is really important because a lot of people do have this skill, like naturally have this skill, to identify what was happening while their move was going on and then decide, okay, now since you didn't respond, I need to jump instead of doing my whiff punish or whatever else.
Now it's gotten rather painfully laggy.
Well, painfully laggy enough that we got outright kicked out of the spectating. So, yes.
Oh my.
I'm not saying this person is playing on Wi-Fi, but please try not to play this game on Wi-Fi if you can avoid it. In fact, all this applies to basically all games, but many of them don't send polling information as often as fighting games, and therefore it's not as crippling. Fighting games are a terrible position to be in when it comes to this.
I'll admit that you have
Final round. Fight.
Sometimes the best thing is just being able to trust your opponent is going to start the match the same way they always do. My backdash! There with the setups. I think I have trouble keeping track of which exact crack is mine on this stage. I'll have to sync it to the background a little more.
But the important thing is actually the effort to try to track a spot, not necessarily that the spot should never change. Sometimes you just like come across a situation where some aspect of it has reset you so much that you might as well pick a new spot.
And there we see that I have failed. I managed to get too worried about surviving in the corner and such things to return to my spot at the end of it all, when I did finally get out.
Well, generally, if you can manage to kill, you should go for it, but you should at least then recognize how risky was that? How likely is it that my opponent could have dealt with whatever I did? Was that a whiff punish, and so on? When you can recognize, okay, that worked, but it could as easily have not worked, then it tells you what happens all those times when you end up losing to someone against whom it really doesn't work.
On the other hand, he's spent all of his meter to equalize our life, so I guess I don't care. This is my new spot now. None of that, please. That was super dangerous. I should not have done it at all. I might land on my spot. Not quite.
You win.
2 inches short of victory.
Indeed. I'll have to have the place remodeled so that my spot is in the correct location.
And with that, we're going into the more quote-unquote standard matches of the lounge, at least until our Zangief player, assuming they stick around, ends up back in the rotation.
Let's do this.
Alright then, so this now against a wolf. And combining a bit of the thoughts we were having last time in regard to not worrying about certain types of attacks. have my notes here, but I seem to not remember it off the top of my head. Boop. Got it. It ties together relatively well in this case.
I'll show
So
you
let's
the
do
devo-
this.
Round one. Fight.
And so actually based on that example that we were talking about before, this is... Here you can easily see that this is a character that intimidates me. Based on how little I'm willing to stand still because of my fear of flash... not flash chops, but the head crush and all of that sense. Although I'm quickly becoming less intimidated, apparently. Getting greedy. But I don't have to. Well, I managed to end on my spot. So that's a bonus. Although I did not necessarily do as good a job of holding it this time around. And here I want him away from it, apparently. Spending a lot of time in offense. Of course, I can simply do that if I wish to. And victory precisely over my lamp.
You win.
On top of everything else, this is a very useful way to create a role reversal style situation where the player who is normally defending and managing to get their damage off defending correctly is put in this position where they have to, depending on the life lead,
Fight.
actually have to attack. Once they're put in that position, they have to rethink a lot of their options, just as the player who is normally attacking has to rethink theirs. In fact, if you are the offensive player, obviously if you manage to lose the life lead, you should still try to get it back at some point. But at that point you could think, well, okay, I need to get that back eventually, but for now, I'm getting points by standing on my spot. And at some point, I guess I'll wait for an opening, or maybe I'll just go in semi-randomly once I feel like I've gotten enough points from getting on my spot. Overall, though, you're not left with that same feeling of, okay, I have to go in now because I don't have the life lead anymore.
Yes, I
Your
know that
opponent might
useful
be
effect
completely
earlier.
willing to hang out on the other side of the stage, though.
And there you see me get greedy and lose all of my points.
Looks like I won. Round 2.
Hem.
Fight.
Another good way to deal with this is to recognize that some players will back out of your optimal spacing simply because you're in it. Especially if yours occurs before theirs does. This is an easy way to reclaim your spot against a lot of people. Basically, move to your optimal spacing and wait for them to walk backward. If your feeling ends up being, well, what if I get hurt, then it's not really that optimal a spacing, is it?
Indeed. By selecting a space a spot that is slightly forward of where I started, I gained the interesting concept that of just being willing to pay some amount of life just to get to my spot, and just being completely okay with that, like as an explicit, this is what I'm going to do now, sort of thing.
This also helps us to do much better risk calculations than our standard, okay, my opponent might not be defending properly, let me go in. Because it adds the additional level of, my opponent might not be defending properly, or they might, but if I do this right, I will still end up where I want to be. They'll just hurt me.
I forgot I had more buttons. Look at this atrocity. I was not pressing enough buttons.
This is always the hardest moment, where you have the spot, but you can barely manage to win. It would make more sense in many cases to go for pressure there, but that's the challenge. The challenge is to have your opponent at a sliver, know that you all too will die in one hit, and then it will happen the other way. But again, Wolf is the one that lost out in that exchange. In terms of learning or getting better at this game, he eventually did exactly what we were talking about. He went for his EX move that would do enough damage that it was hard to avoid. That doesn't really help him because the next time that happens, he may not have that EX move and may just lose without getting any better.
Whereas I was spending my whole time trying to do the interesting thing where, okay, can I get you to come forward onto my spot and then cross you up and win that way? Or wait, no, hold on. If you're in this exact position and I Rasenha, will I, etc. Which is a far more educational way of interacting in any case. And you know what? I launched the winning attack from my spot, so I'm okay with that.
Final round. Fight.
Put me on my spot.
It also teaches you the concept of dashing off your spot with the full intention of coming right back to it in order to resolve some situation. which is a lot harder to get yourself to do properly in this game than one would think.
Oh well. Indeed. I found myself in that whole set of matches going, like, I will even more aggressively defend my spot, like, in the sense of, no, I'm not even letting you get close to it. Which may be a little bit aside from the point, but...
Well, in the sense that
Still
it made you
is-
lose, probably yes.
Yeah.
I mean, not all the time, but
hmm
you can...
It's interesting that
You
I have to
can
be
also-
careful.
Yes. It's easier to use this as a measure of your own aggressiveness as well. To recognize, I probably will go in too hard. Because you can gauge it by, yes, they're on your spot and you're not on it, but you probably should think of a plan to get there. Because if your opponent is willing to come after you, you may be able to just evade your way back to your spot.
True. And just jump over them at the right point, or just not worry about it.
Dash under, jump over, go for certain really weird moves. All these things work a lot more effectively when your mind is not on the fact that you must hit the opponent to get them off the spot. Slowly but surely, this sort of thing teaches you to read your opponent's intentions because you have to do so in order to most efficiently get points for standing wherever you want.
Round one. Fight.
So understanding when they're likely to attack or defend helps out a lot more. Similarly, one can launch attacks that you know will either check the opponent or be saved when blocked, with the full intention of just dashing right back if it's blocked, and technically dashing right back if it hits too. Opponents who are freaked out by you either not moving or moving only a little bit are often the sort of players that you can launch relatively safe attacks against, i.e. attacks that are safe mostly because of how you spaced them, not so much that the move itself is safe. So you shouldn't view it as, my spot must be defended from it, I should never leave it. The idea is more so, I'm aiming to most efficiently get off it and get back on it, without my opponent getting much chance to knock me off it.
Indeed. Because, I mean, if they can't ever hold it, it was never really not yours.
Round two. Fight.
You know, I think the thing that I was doing before was sort of my impatience finding its way out again, if you think about it. Because fundamentally it was just, if I am doing the keeping the opponent away more aggressively thing, I'm sort of just, like, refusing to sit still and enjoy my spot.
Well, again, it depends on whether or not you have advantage or not with your supposedly aggressive reaction. If you are relatively sure that being aggressive has no real risk or very small risk relative to letting your opponent walk up to you, then you probably should do it.
I just tend
And
to...
technically, the problem you have is more so that you got stuck in it, rather than that you did it, because functionally that is a good idea. When your opponent's response to your situation and you being calm is to come at you full throttle, every option you have for aggressively defending yourself is good, because if they're coming at you full throttle, they're usually not measuring to trick you. They don't have a lot of setup to make sure that you will try to push them away and fail or do an unsafe move and they'll manage to beat it. Those aren't usually the plans. If those were the plans, they would usually need to put a little more time or effort into it, or be much higher level at least.
So free counter hits. Sort of.
I'm all warmed up.
This sort of thing also teaches you when your own movement needs work in a specific way.
How do you mean?
If it was required that you were in fact very precise with your location in order to be able to defend your spot, then it also implies that you need to be that precise with your location normally.
Indeed.
Alex wins. Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
Not really sure what the purpose of that knee drop is. For those who are not aware, Urian's Violence Knee Drop is a very powerful move when spaced exactly correctly. Against an opponent who is not expecting it and unable to respond in time, if you can get it to hit at the right point on their body, it is an extremely powerful move. Against an opponent who is expecting it, it can almost always be countered with any upward hitting button. However, it does tend to beat lighter ones, especially if you're armored. More importantly though, if you move correctly and block it, he's usually very, very unsafe, to the point where you could always really just throw him, as demonstrated there. So against Alex, this is particularly dangerous, given that he will just power bomb you.
Alex wins.
Well, sadly it seems our Zangief friend has left. But we can in fact seem to
But we
practice
plug
this among
armor.
ourselves.
It is in fact one of the easier things to practice on your own. As in within just one group, because you can always change the parameters so very slightly. For example, for Amara, who is normally defensive and able to do this relatively easily, pushing someone else off their current position is a bit more work.
So she would pick, for instance, Dwolf's start point as her own spot and have to try and get there.
Okay, let's rumble.
That's one way of doing it, but I'm generally talking about whatever spot your opponent is occupying for more than just a few seconds, well, no, let's go with a few seconds, like 3 seconds. Your opponent occupies X spot without moving forward for X amount of seconds. And you end up thinking, how do I get you to move from there? And if you can't come up with something, then you probably don't have very strong offense.
Indeed.
However, it is completely valid to fake your opponent into reacting to your approach and then hit them with something else. This isn't really the sort of thing we were talking about. That is usually how, in fact, we learn those sorts of fake outs. Which is why, as you've seen demonstrated when I'm playing Sandbag Casuals, once I've taught my opponent that I can beat them on defense, I just go back to going in. Because at the end of the day, I know from much experience in my youth that eventually I will meet an opponent that I can't get to budge, that I can't get to move. And I have to know how to open that person up, or I'm just going to get frustrated and lose, and get frustrated in ways that lead to really bad types of losses too. Types of loss that make you salty and you don't learn anything at all. So with my character and her floaty jump, not funny. I have to recognize what exactly can I do to you to make you ignore the fact that I want to jump at you, for example, other than, you know, just jumping at you repeatedly and hoping you eventually fail the anti-air. Which is a valid strategy if you have a character who has multiple jump arcs or multiple jump actions. This is actually real, you can get away with this. But it's still not a good idea. Because, once again, you're taking a relatively large risk. Your opponent just has to guess right like 2 or 3 times. Usually just 2, in fact. And you've lost the life lead, and you've often lost the game because many characters in this game get their reward for anti-airing after the anti-air. They get it for pressuring you or doing a reset that sets you up after the anti-air has happened.
It occurs to me I do not see Amara use her CA very often at all. Because I think it probably would have closed that out a moment ago.
You have to be really ready on those things though, and it is, after all, harder to execute than most other things.
Fair enough, I suppose.
But that sort of flow where you are putting on a certain type of pressure and then you suddenly switch it, either your pacing or the rhythm, or you just decide now is the moment to jump after making you think about all the stuff on the ground. That's how you learn that sort of rhythm in this game.
Round 1.
But the core of it is definitely about being unafraid for long periods. In fact, that's conceptually where the famous Umeshoryu comes from. It comes from being completely unafraid.
And then ending up with your opponent never imagining you would do something at this particular moment because it's obviously such a terrifying thought or whatever. And then they die.
The other thing that helps with this is that whenever your opponent uses an evasive method to get off the problem position, basically your aim is to get them off the spot, you attack and they evade you. Most of us have an instinct to chase them, to let that scramble become the next aspect. But you've already done the thing in question. You've already gotten them off the spot. So if you're thinking about it clearly in that regard, as long as they leave entirely, you can even like think of it as taking points by moving to the spot for a very short period of time, claiming it, take the points, and then move on and grab the points from the new spot. The overall point is, though, you don't have to chase them immediately, and we have a strong tendency in lower levels to immediately chase after an opponent because they have evaded our attack, when it's not really that necessary. It depends on the way they evaded us or how much damage they could do from the new position, but most of the time, if we're expecting a counterattack, if we're expecting them to make an effort at all to get back where they're going, we don't actually benefit from immediately trying to do our own. The opponent's attack is usually limited and often reactable.
Right, I am reminded...
For example, Alex here... Well, go on.
I'm reminded actually that the random light Shoryuken in neutral is in fact part of Amara's tactics for this match, but I don't remember what specifically it was designed to get in the way of.
It stops Alex from doing pretty much everything imaginable.
I see. Well,
Every button Alex sticks out, every weird random idea he has, they all basically lose to Light Shoryuken because of the hitboxes that Alex uses in particular situations.
I see, so it just sort of suppresses him overall.
But there's more layers to it. For example, when Alex is doing particular styles of movement, he's actually easier to suppress with medium tatsus. But once you've managed that, the opponent tends to avoid those particular methods, and they want to stick out long buttons at particular spaces, which are easier to just uppercut.
I see. And it loops back all around in the cycle.
This is particularly true because if Alex sticks out a button outside of range in order to keep you from approaching him, and you light uppercut and whiff, Alex can't usually recover in time to land a crush counter.
Right, because long enough buttons would still be relatively slow. Okay.
So your biggest risk is Alex absolutely expecting that light uppercut completely, and just blocking and waiting for you to do it with the full intention of hitting you some way. But this doesn't actually work for him well because it means that his focus is on waiting for you to do a move that could easily look like anything else, and you'd easily get in on him to dash or throw him, for example.
Sure. I see.
Dash up like any number of little things you get to be able to do because he's just focused on, okay, I gotta bait that DP. And then it doesn't work.
Okay.
It further helps that in a lot of situations where Alex would want to do things like that dash up throw, note that of course that the light DP is, as always, throw invincible, and therefore it just wins. It also gets you out of the way of that, which is also useful.
That was spectacular. Alright then, I did not know that was going to happen. Good stuff.
Final round. Fight.
So you can see a lot of it is, okay, I need to hit buttons to make you not get in on me, but then you just uppercuts and he doesn't care anymore.
That was interesting.
can use the concept of this to push your opponent about in the stage and mentally.
I suppose if you manage to keep your opponent from being settled at any particular position or such, they could easily get sort of flustered from that. Simply because, well, they don't have any place to reset themselves, and if they constantly feel like you're managing to push them back, even if they can get over you, it can't be a pleasant experience. Alright, so now presumably Suntier will try and defend a position and Amar will try and break it. Or take it from him. And well, I guess sort of get the example of that.
He and I did the other half of this training earlier, where I was the one defending. It led to a lot of information about exactly how and when I can get over certain air fireball things and so on. But defense from Akuma's side is generally harder. Fortunately, Ryu's offense is, as most will admit, not super good. And otherwise their options are very similar. But as a general rule, the way that Akuma defends his position, he doesn't have as many moves for that purpose. He benefits a lot more from Red Fireball and from taking up particular space when he can.
Suntier appears to be celebrating the birds.
One of Ryu's stronger methods, as we were discussing earlier, is actually the fact that he can dash up and parry things and then not have to worry about too much else. Against certain opponents in particular positions, he can be troublesome because his dash up light kick, while it does not lead into very much, is really annoying to deal with for any player who doesn't understand how quick Ryu's dash is. As you've just seen demonstrated, you have to be fairly on point and aware to an almost ridiculous degree to actually hurt you heavily for doing it. In other words, most of the moves that people have time to react with, especially at the correct range, will be no more than if you had tried to get in with any other button and been checked. He gets counter hit, yes, but he's not counter hit in the sense of, oh, crush counter, I'm dead now. It's, I've gotten hit by the same thing I probably would have gotten hit by if I had tried to hit a button.
Indeed. And then at that point you have all of the challenge of counter hit confirms if you want to get any damage in the first place.
It's also that spacing wise, he can be so far out with that same stand like kick that a lot of the time you don't really have a good option to hit. That move was returned to its Season 1 power, which made it really strong. It's just that it's hard to utilize correctly. The other thing that happens and is really useful for you is that when players get into this mindset, they're easy to throw fireballs at. Because now they're not the ones thinking about jumping. Ryu's quick dash also means that he'll go under fireballs, or sorry, go under jumps a lot himself when using this sort of approach. So it's difficult to pin him down, and harder still to make sure that whatever you had in mind, he won't just counter with something like that. But offense in almost every Street Fighter game is at least somewhat risky. You have to take some risk at some point. And recognizing which risks make most sense to you, style-wise and flow-wise, can be really important. But from Ryu's side, it's basically how quickly can I get my opponent to think they should move first, and then beat them up for moving first. Which is another way that Umish or Ryu exists, with this, i.e. where it comes from. The idea of, okay, I'm going to move before you because if I don't, you're going to annoy me. And Ryu just shoryukens that. Learning that aspect of the rhythm is actually one of the heavier quote-unquote fundamentals-based things in the game.
Final round. Fight.
How does one go about actually getting that then? Is it just sort of awareness?
That's
built
definitely
up
experience. That is why this is basically the last thing to teach. Because once you understand this, from here it's a lot of grinding to see if you can grasp what any given opponent is thinking about. Or to see if your mindset, the way you think about one of your options, is too linear or something.
I see.
Because a lot of the time, in games, we're taught this is the way to solve this situation. But as soon as you have two players, there's no guarantee of that anymore.
I was playing a platformer the other night and ended up comparing one of the bosses to fighting games in the sense of, I'm really beating this just by a pattern. But like if I was playing Street Fighter, the boss would now just like adapt and I would have to deal with a completely different pattern. But that's actually not going to happen here for another like 2 or 3 stages of the fight. It's quite a different experience, especially if you're not used to it from playing a lot of them. Or at least not a lot of them lately.
Let's do this.
This one, on the other hand, is more likely to be better the other way. I.e., you're the one defending the spot.
Well, no problem there.
But Santir has a ton of experience from this morning with doing this against a basically footsie character. The main difference between Chun-Li and Karine being that Karine is actually less capable of defending herself from the air or by neutral jumping. But when one goes in too hard, Chun-Li is likely to flinch, whereas Karine is likely to hurt you. So it's a lot more patience and a lot more recognition of, oh, I could do this, but it would be a bad idea right this moment.
I have no answer to air fireballs other than to dash under them, which really I should just be doing.
Round 2. Fight.
So far, so good on my end, more or less, I think. This stage is not quite as easy for it, but I selected the edge of the grasslands.
Round one.
Where I start, more or less.
In fact, maybe from doing it with a little bit, you'll be able to see why it is that those two things are not weird when you combine them in terms of how Punk thinks and plays. Because one does become quite familiar with the range that the opponent will want to try to fake you out at, and therefore when you can whiff punish them based on those things.
Oh man. It did not kill because it didn't land enough hits. There we go.
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Round two.
I was actually relatively far out of position. The way the stage sort of shifts around based on the camera makes it difficult for me to identify my spot here.
But in the end, once again, it's really more so about
Yes.
identifying a spot and aiming to get there. And not just accepting some spot near you because it's convenient.
Indeed. And that more or less works, I think. Because I always have a spot, it's just where that spot is tends to move around based on where I am.
Well, I guess technically
Well,
that well, it depends.
that
Did it
note-
die or what?
I'm logged out. So, on that
I
note,
see.
I think we're done for the evening.
Indeed we are. The lounge itself is going to stay open. One of the four remaining is obviously now the actual person you're searching for. It is 3 rounds, first to 2 characters select off. We normally keep going for another hour or so sometimes, but we don't generally stream this because it will usually be a little bit more stuttery, a little bit less clear on what anyone's trying to do. You might not be able to figure out whose quote-unquote turn it is because people might drop the back. All those things make it a little bit choppy and therefore not as helpful. That said, we'll be continuing this sort of thing for the rest of the week as well. Tune in tomorrow for Guilty Gear, the Tuesday train. Guilty Gear is a game in which this is harder to do, but will force you to think more about your options by doing it. You should also be able to choose whether or not to guard a spot or try to build up more tension gauge, and if you can keep both of those in mind, then you're probably fine. On Wednesday, we will probably be having, as noted before, Under Night in Birth. Whether or not that is exactly us rushing into quote-unquote ranked or not is not yet decided, but it's likely to be along those lines. And on Thursday, we should be having Kame House, our Dragon Ball Fighters Beginners Lobby. Note that that one is Loser stays on, as is the Guilty Gear, so feel free to join us if you want to try to get into either of those games. On Friday, we should have the shorter and cleaner discs guidance for our Dragon Ball Fighters bot, but it should have a little bit extra information on how to utilize it for specific characters and some settings you can use, which will then be released on Sunday on our website 2-mk.org.
And of course, if you want to keep up on all of that information as we go, and anything else that we happen to do, you can keep track of us on our Twitter, 2_mk_FGC. The lounge, it would seem, is currently hosted by Amara, if you do choose to look for that. And so perhaps we'll see you there, or see you sometime this week.
Okay.
Have a good night, everyone.
Round 1.